Hello, hello. Testing one. Yes. You
Testing,
can hear.
testing.
Yep. Welcome back to these. I almost said the history of science. That would be. I'm not as interested in the history of science as I am in the science of history. I guess it's interesting. And I think we were planning on doing one on an episode on the Enlightenment, which would very much be a history of science, which is involved. But
Right.
today, obviously, I'm joined by my buddy Anton, and we are going to be discussing the French Revolution, which is kind of the revolution of revolutions, I think.
Right, yeah.
Even in America, right? Because there's a stereotype, a true stereotype that the world ends with the West Coast for Americans, you know? A very American-centric worldview, which fiscally might be kind of true today.
Yeah.
But
for now.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. But even in the American consciousness, I think the French Revolution looms pretty big.
Certainly, yeah. I think I will add one thing. I think just sort of the American Revolution and the French Revolution are related.
Very related.
But they are not the same in my view, because the American Revolution is a revolution of landowners fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
And the French Revolution can be considered the first and the most, like the revolution of social revolutions.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because for the first time, well, not really for the first time, because we need to think about like the British parliamentarians and all that stuff as well when we talk about like social revolutions, revolutions of classes.
Wow.
But I do think that the French Revolution looms very, very large in that landscape.
Yeah.
People started to think really socially about their class, and the class consciousness started to develop.
Yeah.
And obviously, we know that later on, 200 years or later, that led to communist revolutions, right?
Yeah.
And as we touched on when we talked about the October Revolution, a lot of those later revolutions really drew from...
Oh, yeah. I don't think there would be an October Revolution without the French Revolution.
Probably not. And not to mention the Republican idea was essentially enshrined during the French Revolution.
And like what you're saying about the American Revolution being a revolution of landowners, this is something that kind of struck me one is, and this is kind of foreshadowing, is Marquis de Lafayette, right, known as the hero of two worlds for his activity in the American Revolution and French Revolution. And when he died in America, he was mourned very widely. He was a hero of the American Revolution. When he died in France, it was a little bit of a mixed reception, because France's revolution, disambiguation, it kept going, and he was a divisive figure there, whereas the American Revolution ended with the Treaty of Paris. We had the War of 1812, but that was kind of an aftershock, whereas the French Revolution kept going. And I think part of that is with the American Revolution started with this idea of the rights of an Englishman, the proper rights of an Englishman for the American colonists that the Brits were trampling over.
Yeah, specifically white landowners, male.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And so that's what the revolution started as, and that's what it was fought over. And when the break with the king consummated in 1776, which I think obviously a lot of the rhetoric in the Declaration of Independence and the Founding Fathers were students of the Enlightenment, right? They were weirdo deist Freemasons.
Yeah.
But
which will loom large in this installment as well.
Of course, but you kind of have this model, this ancient model of the king and parliament since time out of mind. And that was the model that the American revolutionaries modeled after. So once the king was kind of out of the picture, because the king was stomping on our proper rights as the Englishman, well, then you turned to parliament. And the American parliaments were generally the local elected legislatures they're the local elected legislatures that they turned to. That was like the immediate what they turned to, and it was pretty natural. And these legislatures were white landowners. Right. And when it came time to form an electoral system of democracy for America, it was modeled after that. And it was pretty painless, right? I mean, painless in terms of, 130,000 died of smallpox in the American Revolution. But politically, it was pretty painless because popular sovereignty basically was just the old English system.
It was already sort of kept by the British.
It was new.
The British system.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't even say it was new because, the Magna Carta was what, early 17th century?
1500s, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, even earlier.
I thought it was 1512. I could be wrong.
I remember the 12 number, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So the Magna Carta was the beginning of that.
Yeah.
And Magna Carta, as we know, it was the barons. It wasn't like the people. It wasn't like the peasants or like somebody like that. No, it was the barons. And then obviously that progressed to where landowners of a smaller caliber started to have power. And obviously at the time of the American Revolution, most of the people coming over to America from Britain were like the second or third sons who needed or wanted land of their own. Yeah. And there's plenty of land here. And they formed the new aristocracy.
Yes.
The new aristocracy of America were landowners, as we've sort of discussed already. It's important to note that was already kind of a thing in Britain at the time. Yeah. Whereas in France,
new thing.
They had a whole different system.
New thing, no continuity.
They had a comparatively medieval sort of governmental system with the Estates General.
Which
I think we'll probably touch on in just a sec here. But no, it was brand new, and moreover, the people, the actual not landowners, the urban poor, started to have a voice as a result of the revolution, which is really, really interesting. Yeah. And we'll cover that today.
Yeah, and that's why I say the French Revolution is kind of in our modern consciousness the first quote unquote real revolution. The American Revolution was this parliamentary enshrined, right? Mm-hmm. The French it wasn't hard to implement democracy or popular sovereignty, if that's what you'd like to say. In France, how do you implement this new government? How do you implement these new ideals? How do you what do you even define as popular sovereignty? Who should have it? That's new. And I guess let's just start at getting into our story. Now the causes of the French Revolution. This is a very, very divisive topic in history. I'm probably going to go with a bit of the mainstream report, but not dig into too much of the details because I don't think
there's a right answer.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody would agree with on a very large scale, which is economic woes. I don't think anybody would disagree that there is great economic woes. Yep. People were starting to not be able to feed their children.
France put a lot of money into the American Revolution.
Yes.
And that did not bode well for their economy at all.
No. And then there was right after, they had a little war with Britain for a while, right after the French Revolution, if I'm not mistaken. And there's new social ideals that are changing. And I think I'm not going to put too much emphasis on the social ideals, because I think generally how these revolutions go, as I see it, is there is this maybe elite, this that does have these political ideals that they wish to implement, but a lot of the power behind these revolutions are hungry people. Yeah. They just see inefficacy and they want it to change, right? It's kind of hard to have ideals when your children are starving. But I think it is good to touch on the changing social attitudes, and I think you see this with about 100 years earlier, with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV, the Sun King. And this was basically the Huguenots were this French Protestant group in Catholic France, when to be French meant to be Catholic. And their Edict of Nantes said, yeah, you guys are cool. We don't want any religious strife. And Louis XIV, pretty reactionary leader, we might say, basically revoked it and said, no, Protestants can't be around in France anymore. And instead of this religious, instead of a more religious, I want to say a word for ethno-religiocentrism or whatever, which is kind of this old model, or respecting the king. The intelligentsia in France thought this was totally barbaric. They said, well, the king should have consulted us, which is, by the way, to our modern minds, we're like, oh yeah, of course the king should consult the court of public opinion. Back then, no. That's a new idea. And the intelligentsia wished that the king wouldn't, bother with this boorish religious conflict of superstition and enthusiasm.
It's important to note as well. I think that these wars of religion in France were quite a while before the revolution.
Yes.
So in like the early 1600s, really, there's a great painting of Cardinal Richelieu, who was if anybody has read The Three Musketeers, he is the main antagonist, you could say, of that book. And that's actually I think that The Three Musketeers is a really interesting view of the old French system, even though it was
regime.
That's
a term we're going to be.
I don't know how good our French is, but I certainly will not try to pronounce anything properly.
I took 5 years of it in high school.
Oh, there you go.
High school language doesn't count. I was trying to read Lefebvre, Paysans du Nord, which is like his study on the peasants in the north, and I just ended up. There's no translation of it, so I was like, I'm like cracking my knuckles. I'm like, let's get into it. I just ended up looking up a summary in a journal on Gistore. I couldn't get through it in its original French. Sorry, go on with your thought though.
No. I just wanted to note that it had been going on for a while, and actually the Huguenots, they were expelled eventually, as you noted. I've actually been to a Huguenot church in America.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's in Charleston. It's a really interesting.
That's bizarre. That's like anachronistic. That's like if you went to like an Anabaptist. Well, I guess the Amish, but
it's really, if you're ever in Charleston, man, check it out. It's a historic,
I'd really like to check it out. Yeah. It's not still active, like
I think it is.
No way.
I think it is. They have a local group of Huguenots that attend the church.
That's crazy.
It's a really interesting pink color as well.
Yeah,
and it feels very Catholic when you go in there.
Yeah,
but because these were like early The Protestants they're not all of the same stripe, at this point.
No.
Yeah, you got the Anglicans, obviously, which is like one of the main, I guess, in America, influences on Protestantism.
Yep.
Episcopalians, Presbyterians, from the Scottish, it was very powerful in Scotland.
Yep.
But I definitely think that Huguenots are a really interesting breed of Protestants, and they have a very sort of curious history, but that's sort of tangential to our main topic here.
Yeah, and I was just bringing up the revocation of the Edict of Nantes because that's 100 years ago, and it kind of gives an indication of the beginning of these social changes. The king should consult public opinion. That's a new thing. The king should not bother with these religious strifes. That's a new thing. One, that's a reaction to the fact that Protestant Catholic religious strifes in Europe was extremely bloody and not something anybody people were tired of. I think a lot of that relaxation of religious norms and religious freedom was just a direct response to just fatigue, war fatigue, right?
Right, yeah.
And so you have these changing social attitudes, and then of course you have these Enlightenment philosophers, which looming huge over the French Revolution is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, especially with our friend Robespierre, who we will talk about, absolutely. You have these new thinkers, and so
I think just I don't mean to interrupt you, sorry, Andy, but I think another thing. So you're obviously more sociology sort of directed. So obviously, and that's very important. But I also want to note that. Sort of statistically, also France was growing super fast
in the north specifically. Yes,
it went from about 18 million
like
in population
million.
to like 26.
That's crazy. It's like 30 years. I don't know.
From 1700 was 18 million by the census.
Yeah, then, it was like 80, 90.
In 1789, when the revolution started to really kick off, it was like 26 million people,
and that growth was not evenly spread. It was traditionally to the cities. And then especially in the agrarian north. And I'm going to talk about that later as well.
Yeah, but that's a really, really important bit of this problem that France was having at this time, because when you have an explosion of population, it was the most populous state in Europe.
Yep.
It was, I'm actually not sure how many people Russia had at the time.
It was. But I
expect that France was more populous.
I think by the 20th century, Russia had more. I think at this time, France had more. Maybe a listener can correct. But regardless, very popular. Certainly the most populous in Western Europe.
Certainly, yes. And honestly, like with like right now, obviously the biggest ethnic group in Europe is the Russians.
Yeah.
I don't know if we, in modern times, if that's considered Europe anymore, but But yeah, no, population is a huge part of this problem. The economy just can't keep up. The food production can't keep up.
Wars on wars on wars.
Not to mention, of course, like state debt. Right, state debt, huge pillar of
and and you had this inability of the king, poor Louis XVI, who really just wanted to be loved. Don't we all? And he just has this inability to tax the noblemen. He has this inability to just gather money and in order to actually collect more taxes, he needs to call the Estates General, which hadn't been called since Louis XIII. Mm-hmm. And so he's like, fine. Or it might have been Charles XIII. I don't know. It's the 13th. And
probably Louis in France.
And he's also kind of sacked with Louis XIV is probably one of the most, if not the most celebrated French king.
Right. Yeah.
And
the Sun King. Right.
Yeah, but he wasn't running a very cheap empire.
No, he wasn't. Yeah, he was extremely lavish.
Yeah, and Louis XV, who came right after, Chesterton has a line about how quickly social attitudes change, where Louis XV, Louis the Beloved, ended up being succeeded by Louis the Beheaded. And Louis XV, I mean, very well beloved, but kind of on top of this great French expansion, this French greatness is this huge pile of debt. This is an ancient state. This is literally called ancien régime. This is just a state that
the ancient regime. Right?
Yeah. This is just a state that cannot keep up with it.
Yeah.
So Louis XVI.
Also, he was not very lucky in his choice of wife.
No.
Marie Antoinette, who I'm sure you'll mention in a bit, she was not popular with the people at all.
No, they thought she was an Austrian spy.
Being Austrian, And, and I think that we've been talking about economic problems. When economic problems start, people start to look inward and outward at the government. And they start to be really quite critical. Similarly, again, there's a lot of parallels between Louis and Nicholas II
I thought Alexandra immediately.
Exactly, because there are these, I wouldn't call him beloved. Alexander III was certainly not perhaps beloved, but he was exceptionally strong, and he is considered, especially like today in Russia, I think President Putin considers Alexander III to be his favorite monarch.
Oh yeah, well he was the one that got in that train crash or something, right? Yeah, that's a good story.
So for listeners who don't know, Alexander III was in a train crash with his family, and he lifted a metal beam.
Boss ass.
He was a huge man. So obviously there's elements of sort of a cult of hero worship around him.
Yeah, of course. But when I hear that story, I mean, I'm very modern. I've never lived under monarch. When I hear that story, I'm like, hell yeah, dude.
Well, see, and that's base tribalism, and you want to avoid that. Strongman politics are a thing of the past, I think. But no, for sure. And obviously, with Louis, his predecessors were more successful. They were publicly more beloved. Even though, like you said, the cost of that was state debt, which was rising and rising and rising, and nothing was really being done about it. So by the time Louis came around, being a weaker person and king, he was not able to resist the conservative elements in his inner circle, who didn't want to. They didn't want to pay tax.
He initiated. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's just that I was just going to say that he just couldn't. He was not able to overcome this conservative element that did not want to raise taxes on the rich. They didn't want to raise taxes on land. They wanted to maintain their own power, which isn't really Louis's fault. But I think that a monarch with a little bit more sort of political acumen could have moved around it, and obviously we have examples in history of monarchs who did that. Who they just said, okay, well, sorry guys, this is the way it's going to be.
Got to get the eunuchs in the court again.
No, I'm not sure that if Louis had been a stronger king, the revolution would have been averted. I think it's likely, but it's. I don't want to put everything on Louis, I guess, because
he's just wrong person, wrong time.
Like Nicholas, wrong guy for the wrong time.
In an earlier age, I think you could coast by having a mediocre king. This was not the time.
No.
the state had so much debt. Of course, inflation's a problem, and people start getting hungry, right?
Yeah.
And so Louis, in order to, have these financial reforms, there's calls to call the Estates General, which is this kind of tricameral. You can look that up in a dictionary. It's just a three-chamber system legislature. And that was for any real new big taxes, as I understand it, right? And they needed new taxes. They needed financial reform. So he calls this Estates General, and I think just before we get to the critical moment.
Just to clarify about the Estates General, for listeners who don't know, the Estates General consisted, like Andy said, of three cameras, three houses, estates. The first one was the clergy. Yep. Right, so the clergy had a big voice in French government at the time.
And a lot of land.
Right, yes. The church was a huge landowner in Europe at this time, and certainly before that. I think the Catholic Church in general in Europe was probably the biggest landowner
for sure
throughout the medieval period. Yeah. The second estate was the nobility. So these are the guys that are arguing against taxes on the rich, against taxes on landowners. And then the third estate,
everyone else
is everybody else. And that includes rich merchants to the poorest peasant.
And just a quick note about the second estate is the second estate isn't as uniform as you would think. There's two. I think they both kind of voted uniformly, but the second estate is the traditional nobles. I think it's I'm not even going to try. I was going to try to think the French word for it, but I didn't. You have the traditional nobles, right? Noble families. And not all the times are these noble families terribly rich, right? Napoleon came from a pretty poor noble family.
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course.
And then you have the term used was noblesse rose. And that was the nobles who kind of... they were in administrative positions. They were judges. They were in city politics. And these people were kind of a professional class unto themselves. And they, worked hard to get there. And they didn't want anybody to tell them no. And the problem is, and also note about the first estate, a lot of poor priests, right? Being a priest in this time, especially as a rural priest, wasn't always glamorous. And a lot of the priests from the first estate, or clergy from the first estate, ended up joining the third estate when the third estate did its thing. And when I say did its thing, I mean when the third estate called for a single unified legislature wherein the third estate would be dominant. And this is...
Based on population.
Based on population. I mean, that seems normal to us today, but I think this is the move of the French Revolution. And this is... This agitation was kind of a result of a French priest by the name of Sieyès, and his actual religious devotion is often called into question. A lot of people think he became a priest so he could have time to work on religious writing, which is not to work on political writing, which is not something anybody would say about becoming a priest nowadays.
No.
But he had this pamphlet called "What is the Third Estate," which kind of agitated, like, hey, like we carry these two estates on our back, we do all the work. And they can outvote us on whatever, because it's three houses. If these other two estates, which only represent 5% of the population, decide they don't like us, they can do anything against us. They can do anything for themselves. They'll always outvote us. And people in the third estate were like, huh. And another interesting thing about the third estate is there was weirdly enough an enforced dress code for the Estates General. Obviously, the clergy and the noblemen had attire traditional to their standing in society, which often was a little regal, you might say, a little ornate. The Third Estate, actually, interestingly enough, was forced to, by certain conservative ministers, wear all black. And actually, it was like a funeral, like these very simple... almost humiliating clothes of all black. They had to wear these black hats. And this wasn't exactly Louis's doing. When Louis heard about this, he was like, "No, don't do that. They're going to get pissed off." And which a little bit of political acumen on his part.
A little bit, It's another thing about Louis, that he wasn't completely devoid.
No,
he was a thinking, reasoning person.
Yeah.
It's just, maybe he didn't have quite the skills to maintain the situation. Now, all of this stuff resulted in a great amount of solidarity among the Third Estate. And I think that's a good sort of segue into the tennis court oath, which I know that you were planning on talking about. So,
I was just saying, this Third Estate basically says, listen, we're forming the National Assembly, and it's going to be us, join us, get in or get out, right? And the Second Estate was appalled by this. The First Estate was a little appalled, but a lot of the priests actually, I keep saying priests, that's clergy. A lot of the poorer clergy came over and joined.
Yeah.
And Louis he's a little nervous. This is this Third Estate taking over the whole legislature and calling themselves the National Assembly.
Yeah. Well, the Third Estate, and they also, and this is an important sort of anecdote, is that they got together in a tennis court.
Yeah.
I think, right?
Well,
it was a tennis court,
so
right?
they were forced, Louis said, we're actually using this, the place where the estates meet for a meeting. Sorry, you guys actually can't meet, kind of like a dispersionary tactic.
Yeah.
And so the National Assembly went to a tennis court and famously said, we're not leaving until we get a new constitution.
Right.
That's the tennis court. I wanted to get that little thing where Louis tried to disperse them before we got to the oath. I just wanted to slide that in there.
Yeah, my apologies for rushing ahead here.
No worries.
But yeah, so the tennis court oath is a really important stand of the Third Estate, now in solidarity with each other, with some of the clergy, saying, okay, well, we're not going anywhere until there's a written constitution.
Yeah.
And this is a big deal, because now you've got this assembly assembled together, in basically, I wouldn't call it open rebellion, but I would say, okay, well,
they were out in the open and they were rebelling, brother.
Now these poor people are demanding a feasible change to the government.
Yeah.
And this is, Andy was saying, it's brand new. This is something that had never happened before in France.
And there's these protests that go on at the same time. I think the Third Estate was kind of agitating the rest of the countryside a bit. Like I said, there's this political elite that maybe has all these ideas, but really the brunt of it are hungry people. And this Third Estate starts agitating these protesters. And Louis I keep saying Louis, I should say the French government, but it's an absolute monarchy. Monarch's a figurehead. I'm going to say Louis, even if he didn't explicitly say it.
Yep.
Said, okay, get them out of there. And the military was like, no. Which another thing that's a parallel with the Russian Revolution is bad things happen when your military does not do, or your National Guard does not do what you tell them to.
Well, where does the military come from? The rank and file are just peasants.
Yeah.
They're from the salt of the earth. They see their own class, essentially, and this is where we start getting into class consciousness among the military especially.
Yeah.
They see, okay, well, we're being asked to suppress something that will benefit our families at home, so why would we continue to do what we're doing here?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And so you have these protests, and then you have... I think considered by the French to be the real start of the revolution. We would say the agitation starts. The agitation starts. I consider the convening of the National Assembly by the Third Estate to be the beginning of the revolution politically. But I think many people would not deny that the real concrete symbol is, of course, the Bastille. The storming of the Bastille, and is Bastille Day is still celebrated in France.
Right, very important.
As a national holiday. And this Bastille was built... Now, the Bastille is this huge castle built in the 1370s by Charles V, and it featured very prominently in a lot of French domestic disputes in the wars of religion. It was a stronghold. I can't go too into detail, but without getting sidetracked, but this is a building that has a lot of history. There's been a lot of blood that's been spilled on the walls of this castle.
Yeah.
And this is kind of a huge symbol of the ancient regime. And eventually, I think by Louis the 13th or the 14th, it kind of just became a prison specifically for political prisoners, Yeah. And going back to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, Louis the 14th, people that spoke out against this or really kind of caused friction against Louis's all-powerful decree were just thrown in there. It was for political prisoners. Anybody that disagreed with the Louis capital or plural, the Louis, right? They were sent there. So the Bastille was said to have like hundreds of people that were wrongfully imprisoned by this ancient regime. So let's tear it down. And there's a huge siege of this castle with actually 83 people died in this siege. But eventually the governor of the castle, Bernard René de Launay, surrendered, immediately was executed. And the castle was torn down. And in its place today, it's called Place de la Bastille.
Never surrender to an angry mob, listeners.
Nope.
It's almost never a good idea.
Go down with the ship. Go down with the ship.
Yeah. It's never a good idea.
Yeah.
So.
And this kind of tearing down of the Bastille, I mean, this mob was willing to I'm not saying willing to but this mob had enough power in them to tear down this castle. Like it's rubble today. You go there today and it's literally, it's a square. I think there's still pieces of like rubble maybe, but this is a castle, and these people just tore it down to the ground. And after this...
this is actually where our friend Marquis de Lafayette, who we mentioned, the hero of the American Revolution, comes into the picture a little bit, because he was, when Louis was... specifically Louis, I think, actually, was faced with this idea of, okay, well, I've basically lost control of Paris at this point. I've got an angry mob burning down buildings, destroying castles. We've got a real problem. So he appoints Marquis de Lafayette as commander of the National Guard.
Very popular figure at this time.
Very popular figure.
Marquis de Lafayette, very interesting figure.
Yes.
I don't know if I can talk too much about him. I'm kind of spending my biography points on the illustrious, incorruptible Robespierre. But I think,
so he's put in command of the National Guard. I think it's 15th July, 1789. Don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. But actually, this is where the French colors come from. I don't know if you were aware of this, but he combines the colors of Paris, which are red and blue, with the royal white, and he creates a cockade, which is like a rosette, basically, of these three colors.
A little pin that goes on your hat.
Exactly, and it becomes a symbol of the National Guard, and later then of all of France. So he gets put in charge, and he starts to try to make a difference, and almost immediately, he runs into problems because, first of all, dispersion. It's a complicated matter. Second of all, politically, people immediately started asking questions about where do his loyalties lie, right? Because he, and this is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but he was not exactly capable of containing the royal family, and there was a lot of questions about whether or not he wanted to.
Well, he was always a constitutional monarchist,
I
right?
Would say,
Marquis de Lafayette's an interesting figure because he had these Rousseauian, little bit of liberal ideals in his youth, and he saw the American Revolution, and he, on his own volition, he was a young guy, he was in his 20s when he did this, got on a boat, went to America, and said, "Hey, give me some troops." And they were like, "Who are you?" And eventually they gave him some troops, and he proved to be quite a capable commander.
He was a tremendous commander.
And,
I think he saved Washington a couple times.
And Washington's right-hand man, right? And he comes back, and so he kind of has a lot of I don't want to say like liberal cred, but he's got a lot of democracy cred, right?
Because the American Revolution, while it was a revolution of landowners, ostensibly did have sort of undercurrents of this Rousseauian lock,
especially in the language used with regards to one, the Declaration of Independence, and then later the Constitution, which is again, this might be theorizing too hard because I'm not sure how much the American Constitution was in the minds of the French. Certainly.
Well, I think it was definitely, so maybe not in terms of necessarily political ideology, but certainly in application. I think so. The leader of the commune at this point, I think, is Bailly. Who I don't know much about, but I think that they started to view the American Revolution as a practical application of concept, right?
The French revolutionaries, moderate and radical too, even though some might have seen the American Revolution as not going far enough, right? Still say proof of concept.
Right.
Like they had some trouble, but America was quite stable after. There's the Shays Rebellion. I don't want to get too much into American history, but generally they kind of held down the fort, and so they see this as a proof of concept that this stuff can work, right?
Yeah.
But
do you think Lafayette was happy with this assignment as leader of the National Guard? Because he wouldn't have had as much sort of leeway with the National Guard as he did with, in the American Revolution.
Yeah, I don't know. I really have not. Maybe there's some diaries of Lafayette lying around. Yeah. I'm not super hip on him as a biographical figure, but I do think that he was committed. I think it's undeniable that he was committed to his ideals, and this ideals was just a fairly moderate constitutional monarchy. And this is, I think Lafayette is kind of this figure of the pre-overthrow revolution.
Moderate. And of course, moderates, as we know, are hated by both sides in equal measure.
Yeah.
Because middle of the road tends not to satisfy many people, unfortunately.
Yeah. And
even if it is the wiser course.
Yeah. And of course, Lafayette kind of does stabilize the situation somewhat. People are, for now, happy with it because Lafayette is now put in this position of pretty great power, right? And he's seen as someone that is pretty uncompromising on his ideals. Same with Bailey. And these figures kind of held down the fort for a bit. But Louis just really does not have as much power as he used to. This kind of saddens him. He is kind of ceding more ground to the National Assembly in this case.
Slippery slope.
Yeah, right. And Paris is still a bit of a hotbed. Their National Guard's holding it down a bit, but it's still quite volatile. And Marquis de Lafayette drafts up the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is a very Rousseauian political document, and this is for its age even more radical than I think like the Constitution. I think, and I know that talking about the American Constitution makes you sound like some sort of like Ford F-150, like our founding fathers. But it's a radical document.
It is a radical document for the time, and it's now considered sort of like by some to be a sort of outdated sort of view of these rights of man. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man definitely more radical. Yeah. A lot more empowerment of the lower classes.
And it wasn't, and I think maybe this is a good little indicator. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was not the Constitution, in that it wasn't really a concrete political implementation of ideals. The Constitution kind of laid out the American government in certain ways. It was pretty ideological and maybe a little idealistic, but it still had procedures, material implementations of these ideals. The Declaration of Rights of Man was promises. It was ideals and promises. And this National Assembly that is now going to create this Constitution, that is not the Declaration of Rights of Man. That's more of a little manifesto of the early stages of the Revolution, and maybe later as well, right? With different interpretations. This National Assembly is viewed as, in the constitutional monarchy period, as pretty ineffective at getting people what they want, which is bread. People are hungry, and you start to see these factions form within the National Assembly, and you have, I think, pretty predictably, you have the right, and actually the left-right distinction comes from the Estates General.
Was it not Parliament?
Maybe. I thought it was French. Okay, I could be wrong, but
I'm not sure.
I thought the left-right distinction came from the Estates General / National Assembly.
Could be.
Check me on it afterwards. But you kind of have this more right, very conservative monarchy. They're not even too jazzed up about this whole National Assembly thing, because you're just supposed to convoke the Estates General. Let's make some reforms and then let's go home. I'm not too jazzed about this being here all the time. You kind of have these moderates, and this moderate school is, of course, Lafayette's constitutional monarchs, right? Who wanted, I don't want to say piecemeal change, but reasonable change, rational change.
Yeah. And then on the left,
the Jacobins.
The Jacobins.
The Jacobins.
Very, very
radical. They're Republicans.
You will be hearing a lot about them because Robespierre and a lot of his contemporaries were Jacobins.
Yes. And these moderate, the right was kind of discredited because, people were still hungry even with their ideas. The moderates were starting to lose ground as they weren't able to feed people enough. I mean, the National Assembly in this 1789 to 1792 period, and that's the period we've been talking about, is viewed still in history as just remarkably ineffective, similar to the provisional government in Russia, right?
Yep. In fact, you could honestly draw many comparisons.
I keep doing it. That's what I keep doing, right?
Yep.
And so the Jacobins start to gain more ground, and Louis is just losing more and more. Now, let's check up on our friend Louis the 16th here. He's not actually entirely opposed to this whole constitutional monarchy thing. He's like, hey, maybe this will make the people happy. This is not a Tsar Nick thing who is just completely opposed to all conservative reforms. I think Louis was pretty open to reform, especially this whole constitutional monarchy thing. It was kind of the people he surrounded himself with, and especially his wife, right, that were much against it. But Louis realized that, hey, these Jacobins in Parliament, they're Republicans. Like, they don't even want me around, and that's something scary to face as a king, a king who I think Louis, like Nick, also saw himself as a father of his people. And he was losing ground, right? He used to be king of France, and then now he's notably king of the French, which kind of sounds like the same thing, but it's definitely a lot less mandate of heaven, right?
Right, and it's also a title that was used by Napoleon later.
Yes.
Emperor of the French.
Yes.
I don't think he ever called himself Emperor of France. I think it was always Emperor of the French.
Yes.
And that's getting far ahead of ourselves here. But it stuck, basically, this change.
And Louis is kind of scared about all this instability, and he tries to flee to Varennes, which is it in Germany or Austria?
I think it's Austria.
Oh, Austria, yeah.
It's hard to say because back then it's all different.
Yeah,
it's like Holy Roman Empire.
He tries to flee to Varennes to, I think, meet up with either his brother or his cousin. And he is caught and he's sent back to the capital. Yeah. And people really lose faith in him after this. They see him as maybe he has a little bit of treason, or maybe he is specifically kind of courting these foreign powers to bring him back in.
Right, to maybe like intervention.
Yes.
And actually, I should note, before we go any further, Marquis de Lafayette at this point loses a lot of face as well.
Yeah.
Not just because of some later events, but also because he was not able to keep Louis in check.
No.
So people start to really ask of Lafayette, is he really on the side of the revolutionaries, or is he on the side of the king?
Yeah.
And this is where being a moderate really starts to bite him in the rear because, and I think with Marquis de Lafayette, of course, there was the massacre.
Yeah.
That really affected his standing.
Yes. Yeah. American Revolution, having a public massacre by public servants is not always a great idea. I think in any revolution, you'll see that.
Or in any situation at all, actually.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just checking my notes. And Louis does try to embrace his constitutional monarch thing. He has this Fête de la Fédération, which is fête is like French for like party, but can be more used as festival. I think in modern usage it's more party. But it was like a big festival feast of this new federation of the French constitutional monarchy. Lafayette pins a little tricolor cockade on Louis the 16th, and he's like, this is awesome.
Look at me, constitutional monarch.
Yep. Everything's sick. Lafayette does this little massacre.
Which on paper, by the way, with the Fête de Fédération, like, it's interesting because when you think about it on paper, it's like, this is a good idea.
Yeah.
This is like, okay, well, now the king is embracing this this sort of spirit of the republic almost style stuff, constitutional monarchy. You're starting to see real like progressive movements. And it's like, okay, well, why didn't this work?
Yeah.
And it's in part, it's because people are still hungry.
People are still hungry, right?
The economy is not fixed.
Right. Yeah. And, and so an interesting thing that you say people are still hungry is another parallel to the another parallel to the Russian Revolution is there is this movement that storms, I don't want to say storms the palace, but the General Assembly, which was seen as increasingly ineffective. People are hungry, and there is this great protest that is started by 7,000 women. And you know why this is? And that's because women are the ones that are in the bread lines. Right. Nothing radicalizes quite like a bread line, right?
Yes,
I mean, you can pass around pamphlets all you want, but when you're hungry, you're angry. When your children are hungry, they're angry. You're in this line for hours. You bring a stool. Some people camp out overnight. Hungry, angry people in close proximity together will start to talk about their grudges and how they might fix them.
Yep.
And you have these 7,000 women walk into the General Assembly, and they're joined by several soldiers, and they're like, hey, like, do something about this, right?
You have the power now.
Yeah, you have the power now. You know, let's make this a little bit more constitutional, a little less monarchy. Let's get some action going so we can be fed. And I think this is Louis and the General Assembly and the moderates. This is an event that causes them to lose more face. And I think very critically, and this is kind of a transition to the next part, is this constitutional monarchy thing isn't going too well. We have these people storming the General Assembly, getting in there somehow and demanding for change, demanding bread. And the reason why I said parallel to the Russian Revolution is, of course, famously the February Revolution in Russia that preceded the October. The February was kind of the more constitutional monarch revolution, or constitutional revolution was started on International Women's Day because the women marched, because they were in the bread lines. And they're hungry. Bread lines radicalized like nothing else, man.
And this is where the Jacobins start getting clever. The left, they start getting really clever because they start to propose ideas in the National Assembly, which are not, they're not going to fly, and they know they're not going to fly.
Yeah.
And they know that Louis will veto because he still has the power of veto at this point. And they know that this will make him look even less like a person who's willing to change things, anti-reform. And this is like a very clever political move by the Jacobins. They know what they're doing.
Yeah,
they have no interest whatsoever in actually getting these things passed.
Oh, no.
They just want
they're
to politically. Yeah, exactly. Very shrewd movements here.
And so the Jacobins kind of first make their real big plays, and they kind of get their foot in the door. And I think when people think of the French Revolution generally today, they think of the Jacobins generally. They think so the French Revolution, and this is kind of a transition to the next part. Of course, we got to talk about what happens to Louis, but kind of has these three phases, which is this constitutional monarchy, and then you have the Jacobins, and then you have the Thermidorians, and everything that happens after the Thermidorians. People look at the Thermidor and everything after as the crucible that made Napoleon, right?
Yep.
It's not very revolutionary. It's just people look at it as the background for Napoleon, really.
Yep.
But
I suppose we should mention also the sans-culottes.
Okay.
Where it means... Huh? Oh, yeah. And they were essentially sans-culottes. It means without breeches.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's translated as without pants, but they were wearing pants. They just didn't have, at the time, the culotte was worn on the outside of the pant, sort of like in the area where the boot comes up. And this term refers specifically to the poorer Republican movement, sometimes synonymous with Jacobin, but not always. But yeah, so they're very important. You will hear if you ever read anything about the French Revolution, you will hear about them.
Yeah. And I'll have to talk about that with Robespierre a bit as well. Yeah. But also, this is very interesting. Is if you look at paintings, it's very weird to look at like paintings and portraits of this kind of 16th, 17th century, because it's like this whole powdered wig thing, this whole like really ridiculous wear, right? And in these paintings of the French Revolution, you see people with these unkempt beards, brown hair. They're not wearing, they're not wearing the breeches anymore. And the Jacobins, right, were these sans-culottes. And so right before we get into the Jacobins, I just want to kind of sneak in there is the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars. And this is Austria and Prussia were seen, and I want to kind of emphasize seen because their actual agency in wanting to suppress the French Revolution and restore Louis to absolute monarchy, kind of up in the air. I am of the opinion that they were pretty comfortable with the constitutional monarchy thing that was going on. Maybe not with the more radical elements, but I think they thought that would sort itself out. That's just my historical opinion. But a lot of emigres, a lot of right-wing emigres, or the nobles, right? After this whole revolution business, a lot of them just like got out of town. You know, took a hike.
And by the way, interventionism is not something that had not happened historically at this point. I mean, Russia, famously known as the gendarme of Europe, but which, by the way, is like a police officer essentially. And specifically, I think it was Nicholas I who was known as this, and it was because he was known for going into other countries and stomping out their constitutional movements with his massive army. So it's not like this is like the fears were not unjustified. It's like, you know, I don't know whether or not they were unfounded. I don't expect that the Austrians were very keen, or the Germans at the time were very keen to have the
Prussians
constitution. The Prussians, sure.
I'm screwing with you,
but like I really don't think that they were very keen to have a radical, revolutionary, constitutional movement on their border. And so, I mean, like, intervention was not out of the question.
No.
It definitely could have happened.
No. And you kind of have this start of the Revolutionary War. One, Austria and Prussia were harboring all these right-wing royalist noble emigres who were absolutely agitating. They were absolutely agitating for counter-revolution. And they were seen as these big threats to the revolution. There's a lot of literature in this period about these emigres, you know, very, very demonized. People also just hated the Austrians, just a rivalry. Marie Antoinette was an Austrian, came from an Austrian family, and she was seen as a traitor, right?
Yeah, not to mention extremely scandalous figure. You know, there's the necklace affair, which basically is it's a whole thing. But just makes them lose face because they're seen as rich, pompous,
spendthrifts,
totally
out of touch,
uninterested in the plight of the common man. Obviously, "Let them eat cake" is a famous line by Marie Antoinette. But at least historically attributed.
Marie Antoinette's a very unpopular figure, demonized much more so even than Louis XVI, right?
And I don't think she really deserved it personally. I think that she was just sort of a product of her.
When you grow up rich and you're completely out of touch with the people. Because Louis XVI, at least, he went out in. He kind of had these public campaigns where he would go out and feed the poor. He would go out and visit his army. You know, he wasn't terribly insular. His wife stayed indoors, right?
And partially because of all the scandals. Because whenever she did go out, she was like attacked venomously by the people.
And it's funny, and maybe this is just like my psychology, or this is just me projecting what history tells about her. But you see these portraits of Marie Antoinette, and she's like, it's like if you just ask someone to make the most like pompous, out of touch, rich ass ever, it's like you see these portraits and it's like that's her, you know. You know, she has this huge, ridiculous hairstyle. So the National Assembly really starts to attack Austria and Prussia, and this is the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, which really engulf France for quite a while. I'm not sure how much I'm going to focus on them. They are huge and they are a part. I just honestly haven't done that much research on them.
Napoleon got to start fighting.
The first Italian campaign.
Right. Yeah.
By the way, greatest military campaign all time. Greatest strategies. Shouts out to my boy.
Napoleon. But I don't think we'll be getting into
goodness,
him.
No.
So just keep in the back of your mind that a young officer is making moves in Italy. So
a little oh my gosh, I just lost it. Artilleryman, right? A young artillery officer is getting his start here, or just right before here. He attacks. So
and Napoleon actually, interestingly, he's not French. He's not
Corsican.
He's right. It's a
bit of an outsider.
The old famous joke. You know, can you tell me what Napoleon's nationality was? Of course I can.
But
anyway, so he was an impoverished noble who came from the island of Corsica.
He was exiled from there. Okay.
Anyway, we're keeping the fair enough. All right.
So we attack Austria and Prussia, and it goes horribly.
Yeah.
And war losses, for those of you that are versed in history, war losses aren't good for a population. So we're spending a ton of money on these new wars that we immediately just get trounced on. The National Assembly is doing nothing. These moderates are doing nothing. Let's storm the palace and let's abolish the monarchy. And so we enter this new phase of French republicanism. And I'm omitting some details here because this whole period is really, this next period, I'm not so concerned about the transition details. You can look into the storming of the palace if you're interested. It is an interesting story. I'm omitting it a bit. The monarchy is abolished, and we kind of have this new Republican system, which is the National Assembly now. And the National Assembly really has a lot of gains from all this, because similar to how Lenin was viewed as a crackpot for always saying these things that were ridiculous, like this war sucks or this and that sucks, and people are like, oh, you're crazy. And then he kind of ended up being vindicated by time passing and those opinions becoming more popular. The Jacobins, who had a lot of radical opinions, the king sucks, this and that sucks, kind of started to look pretty strong here. They were saying that these moderates were not doing enough for the people. They weren't doing this and that, right? And they kind of took a center stage after all this. The Jacobins really kind of gained power, and notably, our friend here, and this is where we'll really get into it, Robespierre was one of the major adjutants for the fall of the monarchy. So he was really kind of positioned for this new position as famously the head of the Committee of Public Safety, which is one of the most devilish names of any committee ever, because this committee is obviously most associated, and this period is the most famous period as the Terror. And this is the 1793-1794 period that was dominated by the Jacobins and their figurehead Robespierre. And these Jacobins were willing to spill a little blood in the name of freedom, in the name of plenty of things. And
another important one is Jean-Paul Marat, who I'm not sure if you were planning on talking about.
I don't.
But he's an important. He had a newspaper, which was a publication. Started in 1789. This is a guy that was involved sort of peripherally with the Bastille storming, but he had been writing about this stuff as early as like 1784. And I think even like 1777 almost even. So he was a very well-known guy. So Robespierre is not the only figure in the Jacobin movement.
Of course,
so it's really important to sort of remember that because Robespierre was at heart, I think, a politician, idealist. Marat was more of like an idealist writer for like the ideals of the revolution. He built on Rousseau, and he sort of took it in a more radical direction. So that was like sort of the backbone, I guess, of the ideals.
In this 1793, 1794 one, The Death of Marat is one of my favorite paintings ever.
Oh, yeah.
It's great. That's gorgeous. My favorite, one of my favorite paintings ever.
Marat was an interesting fellow because he was, among the Jacobins, after he died, there was almost like this religious saying, like, the heart of Jesus, the sacred heart of Marat. Like he was very, he was like like the theorist, right? And he was beloved, and he was an interesting fellow because he had this skin disorder that he had to like live in a bathtub basically towards the end of his life. So the painting that Andy is referring to was he was assassinated by a woman who is part of the Girondin faction, he was killed in the bathtub. So there's this like the painting is this like really well put together, this like suffering martyr basically. And it's really interesting, but it's a bit of a tangent there.
And this period of the French Revolution is the most known in the English-speaking world due to Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. Obviously more things, I think, due to like mainstream historianship, but I always attribute the view of the French Revolution as this bloodthirsty chaos, fire, flames, guillotine, is mostly due to Dickens's Tale of Two Cities, which was very much a kind of wagging the finger at the excesses of revolution. Or
like the Scarlet Pimpernel as well, which is it used to be more widely read, but it was about I think it was a British fellow who was like rescuing the aristocracy, and it's like, oh, he's like a really good guy. Look at this guy, you know. He's and this is an interesting sort of point as well that like in Britain, this whole thing was considered like, what the heck are they doing? It's fine to have a constitutional monarchy. It's totally cool.
But
like,
this whole republicanism thing,
it's a little too far. And I think this was like held by like probably a lot of people, even the peasantry in Britain and other countries, because it's like, this is so radical that it sort of defies the logic of the time. Like, nobody had ever tried this before. Nobody had ever tried to. And the king this is not the American Revolution, like we said earlier. In our narrative, the king is still in the picture, but when he's not in the picture, it's like, what is going on here?
And that's one thing I'd really like to, as we talk more about the Terror, which is the most violent period, the most chaotic period of French Revolution history. I don't want to say revolutionary history because I don't know much about the July or 1848, right? French Revolution disambiguation is my buddy Tony's Discord name is French Revolution disambiguation.
Well, they've had like, what, 6 republics now? 5?
It's crazy. It's crazy. I can't keep track of it, but we're talking about the big one here, boys.
The big one, the first. Big numero uno here.
And one reason why I think, I'm not saying is the cause, but I think a big part of why this French Revolution, revolutionary era is so unstable and is so violent as opposed to certain other revolutions that have more stability, namely the American, is like with the Americans, we knew how to do, I don't say we knew how to do popular sovereignty, but like we said, we drew it from an ancient.
It was already an established tradition.
And this new popular sovereignty, you had a lot of different people that defined it in different ways. And interestingly enough, kind of the chief theorist of the French Revolution, obviously dead at this time, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which they all certainly drew plenty of influence from. He had this kind of good evil duality in man. He brought it back, but he had this as this liberty and slavery, right? And people said, well, people kind of interpreted this whole liberty and slavery dialectic as, well, you know, maybe people that don't have that much liberty should really have the ability to vote, right? Because if it's popular sovereignty, if we're to embody this true spirit of the people, right now we might think of like a spirit that is kind of cynically as just a numbers majority game. But these people really did, especially the Jacobins and Rousseau, really did believe that there was this pure spirit of the people that once they're completely at liberty, that they'll exercise, and it'll be this this great force for historical change. People needed to have liberty first. So right now, let's focus on this little locus of people that really have liberty, that can be trusted to educate people into liberty, and so they can have popular sovereignty. So that, and maybe we might have to cull a few people that really are just enforcing this slavery mindset, you know, and the French Revolution did have a lot of moral overtones, and Rousseau was very famous, Robespierre was very famous for saying that this French Revolution, this great revolution of ours, is about good and evil. And he took this good notion of good and evil from Rousseau. And that's kind of how you can have this very paradoxical figure, Rousseau, who really did believe in this equality of man, this popular sovereignty, this will of the people, that people are this goodness of the people, but was also killing people left and right, killing his way to glory. And of course, I am going to get into why I think why Robespierre is not, a singular figure in this, right? But I think that is something just interesting to note about Rousseau here, right? And his influence.
Rousseau inspired essentially all of the democratic institutions and people that we think of nowadays. Thomas Jefferson was a huge adherent.
Notably, Thomas Jefferson helped Lafayette draft the Declarations of the Rights of Man. So that's another little.
Rousseau's influence is colossal. I think that calling him the father of the revolution is not erroneous, even if he was, dead at this time, and he obviously had no control over what happened next.
How he was interpreted. And
similar to Nietzsche, I think. Like he just dies, and then his ideas are just used for whatever. He has no control. But I do think that Rousseau's ideas stand a test of time. I think they are generally considered, and I certainly think that they are central to modern democracy.
Yeah. And another thing to note about this terror is this terror period. I keep saying Robespierre was killing his way to glory here. That's a little bit of an embellishment. He was certainly a bit of a violent figure. But interestingly enough, the terror was mostly carried out on a local level. It wasn't exactly... Robespierre making, he's checking his list and checking it twice, and instead of getting coal in your stocking, you're getting your head off.
Yeah.
It was more this new fervor of revolution, this new instability that kind of took place, especially on the countryside, but in the urban areas as well, of this localized grudge settling. Like the terror was largely decentralized. It was
kind of like the Cultural Revolution in China.
Yeah.
Like you've got this, okay, so now the government is sort of pro this sort of grudge settling against the rich, and all of a sudden the people start remembering their high school teacher who was mean to them and has like a couple acres of land, and boom, you go. There's a victim of the revolution there.
Right. And this reign of terror really was more people kind of taking the spirit of the age into their own hands and settling grudges pretty locally. And if you could get enough people to wrest someone out of their house and get them to the guillotine, they were gone. It was so chaotic. You really weren't going to be put to trial for this unless, of course, that person had a buddy that was really mad that you did that. And so now you're going to the guillotine, right?
Right.
And this era of the revolution is the most famous, particularly because it was so violent. And like you said, our English-speaking world looks at this kind of like pearl clutching, like, oh, the excesses, especially because Dickens and like you said about these British, the general British reaction to all this crazy republicanism. Interestingly enough, though, not that guillotining's good, but I would say that this reign of terror is a little over-sensationalized in the English-speaking world.
Right. Similar to like the Black Legend that was built around the Spanish Empire by the British, which is where a lot of our misconceptions about how brutal the Spanish were in the New World. Yeah. Not to say they weren't brutal, but they were certainly, it was sensationalized in English language literature.
Yes.
Far more similar here. It's sensationalized, like these huge, like overgeneralizations, demonizations of this movement. It wasn't nice. It wasn't a nice time.
No.
But it like, and we've touched on this before on the show, but it's important to take it in context, but also out of context, in the sense that we need to look at it from an unbiased perspective. Because a lot of our literature on this is written by people who are vehemently against this
skin in the game.
This business.
They've got an interest, right?
So and Robespierre himself was very interestingly. So he stated, at the very least, that he was not interested in taking power for himself. Yeah. In fact, there's a great quote from him. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but Caesar and Catalina was, so everybody knows Julius Caesar. Catalina was like before him, kind of like a fellow who tried to take power from the Roman Republic, or Cromwell. So they seize power from themselves, right? And if they're spineless, people are uninterested in doing good, but dangerous when they start doing harm.
Yeah.
Right. So for him, this seizure of power is more of we need to do this to achieve our goal.
Yeah.
And there's really no way around it.
Yeah.
Because if we let it go to the spineless courtiers, as he called them, it's not, the revolution isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk about this figure of Robespierre a bit more, as a little bit of a biographical focus is, one is Robespierre. Well, one is with my former notes on the terror, right? Very sensationalized. You know how many people died in the terror? Obviously, it was very decentralized, hard to tell, but estimates are around 10,000, which is horrible. It's a tragedy. Breakfast for Stalin, right?
Right, or indeed for the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
Or indeed for, I think the
Revolutionary Wars that came afterwards.
The British Cromwell business.
Goodness
probably
gracious.
Similar numbers, to be honest.
Yeah.
Or more, actually, in Cromwell's case.
Yeah, right. The 10,000 is a tragedy. It's breakfast for many other tragic events in history. I think it's very
Would you say that though I will say this, that would you say that the terror in France, we've spoken about how it inspired other revolutions. Would you say that it like broke the seal in a way for like when a revolution takes power, for sort of a vindication?
Certainly.
And I think so. And I think it can be kind of not blamed, but looked at as like this first example of like, okay, well, when a revolution takes power, they can just start like willy-nilly taking care of their political enemies. I don't think that had occurred previously.
No,
I don't think that occurred during the American Revolution. Obviously, there was loyalists there, but I don't think there was ever like a systemic purging of them. Like many, like I think probably, I don't want to say a majority, but a large percentage of people in the American states were against the revolution.
Yeah.
They were loyalists. Yeah. So, and nobody, they didn't come after them.
No.
So.
Yeah. And this figure of Robespierre is very influential for future revolutions. In English-speaking world, he is highly demonized. And I say demonized as if demonized unfairly. I think he certainly did monstrous things. But one interesting thing about Robespierre is he was willing to, he definitely believed like what he said. I think you have this whole revolutionary government that is remarkably corrupt. The National Assembly is remarkably corrupt. A lot of the people in these committees are remarkably corrupt. And Robespierre didn't take bribes. He was nicknamed the Incorruptible, but notably for his ability to adhere to his strict moral precepts, which he believed everybody should follow. Very absolute. He was noted as being it was very difficult to disagree with him because he believed he was right, you were wrong. That was something friends noted about him. But he was incorruptible, and that was kind of a part of the reason why there was this reaction afterwards. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Robespierre is an interesting figure in that he was kind of a dork. He wore, like you said, there's the sans culotte without breeches. Robespierre was wearing wigs and breeches far after everybody else had kind of ditched them. And he was not a good speech giver, right? People would often... oratory was kind of a national sport for revolutions. It is kind of a national sport for revolutions. And so you have these great orators kind of rise to power and give these rousing speeches, take you to the stars and then bring it ground, back to action. He was a dork. He would just like ramble on about, Enlightenment philosophy and his stuff. But he took power. He kind of had a lot of standing because people perceived him as someone who believed in what he said. And he was kind of the head of he wasn't the head of the Jacobin Club, but he was one of the most popular figures in the Jacobin Club. And they were the ones that kind of ended up benefiting from all this. And Robespierre was on the Committee of Public Safety, a very sinister name. And they were kind of making sure everything was all right out there, including making sure there's no enemies of the revolution, right? A lot of people were... Yeah.
So I think we can sort of segue here because Robespierre was hugely involved in this. Yeah. We talk about the fate of Louis, right?
Oh, yeah.
Which we haven't really touched on yet. Now, the fate of Louis is really quite interesting because it was decided by a vote of the National Assembly as led in the majority by Robespierre. Now, not everybody in the assembly wanted Louis gone or dead. There was a movement, the Girondins, who we've mentioned before as, the assassin of Marat was one. They were very keen on clemency for the king. They didn't want to kill him. They didn't want to. Now, whether or not this was because of, fear of the Austrians, coming in and smashing them, or if it was just, hey, like maybe this isn't really a beheadable offense. But Robespierre did win that vote. It was something like 400 something to 200 something. So it was pretty even, all things considered. Because we always sort of think of this revolution as kind of like a united front. It was not.
No.
It was very split even on the fate of the king. I seem to recall that when Charles was executed in England, it was not so close.
No.
But yeah. So do you have any notes about Louis?
Well, you kind of covered it. You know, the Jacobins took power. They were Republicans. They did not want any of this monarchy business, and I think they kind of shrewdly thought. hey, like an execution of the king will be a good little PR move for us, right? This is like the new standing. And Louis was executed not as Louis the 16th, but as very desacralized citizen Louis Capet, or Capet, C-A-P-E-T, Capet in French. I think when we talk about the lineage, we have the Capetians, so whatever you want to pronounce it as. But really just a fall from grace for Louis, starting as King of France, King of the French, and then citizen Louis Capet. And
it's so interesting to me. I think one of the anecdotes that is, like, to me is really quite curious is that Robespierre was against capital punishment.
Yeah, yes.
Which is hilarious because you've got this guy who leads the terror and he's against the death penalty.
Yeah.
But there's another quote by him, and I already sort of bungled the first one, but this quote is more along the lines of like, yes, the death penalty is a crime, but when you're defending society, in public health and safety, it's okay.
Yeah,
so
and
that was his argument for the execution of Louis.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of getting at earlier with my little spiel on kind of that Rousseauian slavery liberty thing, that like these people undoubtedly believed in these positive ideals. They just believed that, well, we need to make sure these ideals are really inculcated in the populace before we really get going there. Robespierre is a paradoxical figure, but I think the logic was there in his head, right?
Yeah,
I don't think he was he wasn't like a fool. I think it was just like a different times thing. You know, you got to do it for the necessity, maybe for the revolution. So
for me, it's always hard to judge revolutionaries on moral grounds because, first of all, morality, right? It's a complicated matter.
Yeah.
Second of all, a lot of these people believe that by doing what they're doing, they'll achieve a better world. Totally. Right. Yeah. Like Lenin, I think it was Bernard Shaw. There was a British intellectual who went to visit Lenin, and he was really disgusted by Lenin because Lenin was like, okay, well, we'll just have the peasants go and kill the kulaks. Yeah. And apparently he laughed uproariously at this, and the British man was like, what? This is horrible. And it's like, well, do we say that Lenin is like this, like, and obviously Lenin is probably a more loaded figure in the Robespierre because more people know him, but like, is he a bad person? Yeah. Maybe. I mean, depends who you ask.
He was unscrupulous, certainly. He was
certainly, but then again, we wouldn't say that like they were unscrupulous in the sense that, I mean, they were very idealistically motivated. They had scruples. They weren't corruptible. Like Robespierre, for instance, he didn't take bribes. He was totally dedicated to this idea. And he took power because he felt that was the only way to do what was right. Yeah. So it's like, well, we have to consider that. And maybe this is a controversial take, but I always, when I look at historical figures like this, I always say, well, let's look at what their motivations were. Let's look at what social sort of area they came out of. Yeah. Let's think about, what their goals were and how they went about achieving them. And then, obviously, outside of the science of history, you can start judging them for your own for your own self. That's totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. But I think that should be held separate.
And again, if we're sounding like Robespierre apologists, really it's more just kind of I don't say like compensating, but very much maligned figure in history, probably, in my estimation, bit of a monster, right? But, in the English-speaking world, he has a horrible reputation. In France, he's pretty divisive, right? Yeah. Like, there's streets named after Robespierre. I think the street he was killed on is Place de le Robespierre. Maybe it's the street he lived on. Could be wrong, right?
But no, I mean, he's
a controversial, because he is
a controversial figure, but
sorry.
The French owe him a lot, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Even though he was he killed a lot of people. Yeah. He was responsible for a really dark period of time. He was still a pillar of what is now France.
Yeah,
right?
and he was incorruptible. A lot of revolutionaries kind of viewed Robespierre, later revolutionaries viewed him positively as someone who wasn't afraid to do what needed to be done. That's a sinister phrase, right?
The greater good, right?
Yeah. Someone who was someone who was committed to his ideals. And in France, he's a lot more controversial than in the English-speaking world, where he's just totally maligned, just due to our very terror-centric French histories of the French Revolution. And I think maybe now is kind of time to talk about. Again, we're running a bit short on time, so I can't talk about much of the happenings of 1793, 1794. So through this, I can maybe do it through the biographical lens of Robespierre here. Robespierre kind of has his time in power, but he starts to suspect that people aren't too fond of him. And a lot of this reason is because, one is he didn't take bribes. He was very anti-government corruption, and the revolutionary government was highly corrupted, and people, wanted him out so they could, get on doing business as usual. There was definitely this enmity, and Robespierre gets very paranoid, very nervous, and a lot of people think that he's probably suffered a nervous breakdown or something at this point, because a lot of his behavior points to it. He really didn't show up much, appear in public much, except for little speeches at his beloved Jacobin club, who would always love him, right? And so Robespierre suspects there's a plot, gets increasingly paranoid. Oh wait, there is a plot, and Robespierre is overthrown, killed. Kind of brushing over some details there, and then you get into this Thermidorian reaction. And this reaction was not people that said, well, the revolution has gone far enough, let's go back to moderate, reasonable. These were people that were very obviously saving their skins here. They were worried about Robespierre turning on them because he was probably willing to get a little blood on his hands to get some corruption out of government. Mm-hmm. These were people that wanted him out of office. And I think as a little nod to
I was just one last thing about Robespierre that's interesting. The abolition of slavery is super, super important. So we were talking about that we're not Robespierre apologists, but I think this is like a big, big deal. Yeah. Because Robespierre, and I know you were getting ahead, and I apologize for sort of dragging us back to before Thermidor, but a lot of the French who were like, okay, we can't abolish slavery, we can't give rights to black people, to people of color, but Robespierre was 100% for it. Yeah. People were like, oh yeah, we'll lose our colonies. And he said, perish the colonies. Yeah. Forget them. Yeah. This is like a super early movement of anti-slavery, It
doesn't start in Britain until like the 1820s or so, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. And the Constituent Assembly gave citizenship, French citizenship, to all people of color who were born to free parents. At this point, this is crazy. Huge. Yeah, this is huge. Yeah. You've got this absolutely colossal change. Yeah, and this is one of the positive results of this revolution. Yeah, and there are many, by the way. Yeah, but when you start looking at this, it's super important to remember that, I think.
Yeah, and like I said, with this Thermidorian reaction of more moderate people, it was very clearly, even to outsiders, this is just people saving their skin. And the Thermidorian reaction, people don't really care about this. People view everything after the fall of the Jacobins from power and the Thermidorian reaction as kind of a postscript. This is the cauldron that made Napoleon. Yeah. Everything. There is some interesting stories. I'm not going to touch on them, but I think this is really the end of the revolutionary period in France. Of course, we got to fight some wars. Goodness gracious, do we got to fight some wars here? But in terms of internal revolution, not as much. And people don't really, whatever you might say about Robespierre and the Jacobins, people still talk about them. People are still interested in them, and people still debate over them. Nobody really cares about the Thermidors. And of course, the Thermidorian reaction is just the name of, interestingly enough, the French Revolutionary calendar. Completely replaced the Gregorian, and the Thermidorian reaction took place in the then month of Thermidor.
Because they made their own calendar. That's kind of an interesting
it's a total Enlightenment thing of tearing down old traditions and putting in new rational. It's total Enlightenment type deal, but that's kind of the it's kind of like that's really the postscript, and that's not really what I'm interested on touching on here. I think that's really the period. I have a couple addendums I might want to add is an interesting thing about the peasant bloc. This is a bit more niche, but a lot of people, historians in the 20th century, we view the French Revolution as quite radical. A lot of historians viewed it as maybe it could have been a lot further were it not for the fracturing of the peasants' bloc, specifically in the north, right? So we say that a lot of the cause of the French Revolution was this population growth, especially in the agrarian north. There was this whole agrarian crisis, and generally the peasants were split among the wealthier landowning ones and the day laborers, right? And we would, of course, say these, in certain aspects, we might say these wealthier peasants we might call kulaks, right?
Right, yeah.
And another...
in another revolution.
And the peasants benefited enormously from the French Revolution. They got tons of land because during the Jacobin rule, there was this de-Christianization of the empire. A lot of clergymen were exiled or forced to take an oath, right? The Pope really had no real authority over the Catholic Church in France at this point. They lost a ton of land, and it was given to the peasants. But it was given to the kulaks, right? I was trying to think of the not Russian term, but it was given to these wealthier peasants. Yeah. And these wealthy peasants were perfectly okay with this. They're like, vive la révolution, right?
Yeah, heck yeah.
They get a ton they get a ton of land, and they're pretty closely allied with the revolutionaries in the urban areas more. And these day laborers are like, what the heck? But they don't really have power. They have numbers, but they don't really have power. And after the manorial tax is abolished and the tithes to the church are abolished, there's just not that much fervor in this day laborers to really form a coherent bloc, and the bloc is further divided by this landowning and day labor populace, right? And this really fractures the peasant bloc, which a lot of historians in the 20th century, specifically Georges Lefebvre, who I looked at his Paysans du Nord, I looked at that for this information. One is this is an extremely detailed account. I think he went through 1,300 tax records or something for this to gather all the data. But this peasant bloc was
the most reliable way to look at history.
Yeah, that was when I saw the work he did, I was like, holy smokes. But this peasant bloc was pretty, the landowners were allied with the urbans and just went along with what they did. And the day laborers, who a lot of people think probably could have wanted more radical redistribution of land, they couldn't form a coherent bloc anymore. And a lot of people think, oh, what if, right, this bloc had not been fractured so much. And that was just a little addendum I want to add as a fun little what if. We view this revolution as highly radical. A lot of historians in the 20th century took a look at this, specifically Georges Lefebvre and I can't remember the other historians, said it could have been a lot different, and that's not just sociological theorizing. That was very hard data that really indicated that in how the land was distributed from the churches to the peasants, how the money was spent. So that's just a little interesting addendum. I think we're kind of getting close to wrapping up here.
Yeah,
do you have anything you'd like to add before we start our closing remarks? Or
just some stuff on Robespierre, I guess.
Yeah.
Robespierre, interestingly, so he was not really the final victim of the terror, but he was executed close to the end, obviously, because he was the author of it. So, and when he was apprehended, he famously tried to shoot himself.
Yeah.
And was but he failed, and he had to wear a bandage around his mouth to his own execution.
Oh, goodness.
And it was a horrible sight, obviously, for people.
Yeah.
And also in Russia, Robespierre is held in super high regard. There's a monument to him in Moscow.
Have you seen it?
Yeah. I've not seen it, unfortunately. No, but Yeah, so there's one in Leningrad and one in Moscow. And yeah, in Russia, he was held in super high regard in the Soviet Union period. And Lenin called him the first Bolshevik.
Yeah, wow, not even Gracchus Babeuf. We didn't even touch on him.
Yeah. So, well, maybe not the first Bolshevik. He called him a Bolshevik before the term was coined, right?
Yeah.
So he was like a... Like in Dante's Inferno, where there's, or Purgatorio, I think, where there's like the pre-Christian worthies, right? Similar to that, it's like, this guy was one of us before there was an us.
Yeah. And another thing, we keep going back to Robespierre. This episode is a bit biographical.
Well, he's an important figure. I mean, we almost should have done a Lawrence thing on him.
Yeah, maybe this is a bit of a with the second half is another reason why Robespierre really does have a lot of this negative reputation. Again, not trying to... but all these people, a lot of people that were either complicit in the terror, actively in on the terror, were in the Committee of Public Safety or in this National Assembly. What's the name for it at this point? The National Assembly? It's like this national legislature or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
But these people voted to have political enemies killed. A lot of these people kind of had a lot of blood on their hands. Robespierre was definitely the most significant author, but these people were either complicit or actively participating in it. And when it comes to this Thermidorian reaction, it's convenient to have a scapegoat. And Robespierre took the fall, really. And I think that's another reason why, especially in the English-speaking world, he does have this reputation, is it was a very successful PR campaign by the Thermidors to pin the blood that, wash the blood off their hands.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, and I guess as a little closing remark, I'll just talk about the revolution is really interesting in terms of just like kind of like the French cultural consciousness, in that France has this whole legacy behind them that's not entirely coherent. I mean, French people identify with the ancient regime. They identify with the revolutionaries.
With Napoleon.
And they identify with Napoleon. I mean, have there ever been three movements more distinct and different from each other, but yet the French still find something to admire and identify with in each one? And that's really something interesting. And
I think, in Russia, I think that will be the case in the future as well. Personally, that's my personal opinion. I think that people will... and even now, there's a synthesis of we're Soviet, but we're also Russian Empire. We're also the Orthodox. So there's this cultural synthesis. Same thing with France. You've got a series of, like you said, really sort of disparate movements that became quintessentially French.
Yes.
Right?
And it's interesting. You can still go to France and people are knowledgeable on these things. And they still reference them all the time. One time they'll draw from Robespierre, another time they'll draw from Napoleon, another time they'll draw from the Sun King, right? It's really quite interesting. So
we should almost do an episode on Napoleon at some point soon, because
it's so really big.
Interesting.
It's so
big.
It
is huge. And Napoleon is another one of those figures where, was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? Was he something in between? People judge him constantly, and I think that it's almost better to just look at him as just in his time,
or as
we've been trying to,
or as objectively good or bad greatest military commander of all time. More than Alexander the Great, probably.
Napoleon was a very interesting man, a really interesting man. But yeah,
future time. So I think that should about cover it.
I think.
You have been listening to WMTU 91.9 FM, Science and History with Anton and Andy. I hope to catch you next week, and just stay French. I don't know.